A flight attendant walked quickly down the aisle, her gaze fixed on a young boy sitting quietly in first class. She stopped in front of him, arms crossed, and asked a question that would change everything. "Where are your parents?" Just minutes later, she forced the boy to stand and silently escorted him to the economy seats, all under the watchful eyes of the passengers. But what she didn't know was that the boy's mother wasn't just any ordinary passenger. She was the owner of the entire airline. And what happened next left everyone aboard the flight stunned. Micah Sullivan sat quietly in his seat, his small hands gripping the armrests. The plane was filled with the soft hum of passengers preparing for takeoff. His mother had told him to be strong and enjoy the trip, but sitting alone in first class made Micah uneasy. The seat was 2 large softer than any he had ever sat in before. The screen in front of him flickered with a welcoming message. Micah leaned forward and rummaged through his backpack to find his headphones, planning to watch a movie to ease his nerves. But before he could put them on, a figure appeared in front of him. A tall flight attendant. Miss Bennett stood blocking the aisle, arms crossed, her cold eyes locked on him. Her uniform was neat and crisp, but the way she stared at him made Micah's stomach tighten. She tilted her head slightly, her voice smooth yet firm. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" Her tone made it sound like she was asking if a child had wandered off, not the legitimate passenger sitting in his assigned seat. Micah looked up confused. "No, this is my seat," he said, pointing to the ticket attached to the screen in front of him. He had checked it twice before sitting down. "Ms." Bennett gave a forced smile, not even glancing at the ticket. "First class is only for special passengers," she said coldly. "Where are your parents?" Micah tightened his grip on the headphones, speaking softly. "I'm traveling alone." "I have a ticket." Ms. Bennett raised an eyebrow, as if this was hard to believe. She extended her hand. "Let me see your ticket, sweetheart." Micah hesitated for a moment, then pulled the ticket from his pocket and handed it to her. He watched her eyes scan the ticket, her lips pressing into a thin line. The ticket was legitimate. He was sure of it. But Miss Bennett's eyes were still filled with doubt as she handed it back to him. "Who bought this ticket for you?" she asked Micah. Answered immediately. "My mom bought it." The fake smile vanished, and her voice grew darker, no longer polite. "Listen." She crouched down to his eye level. "There must be a mistake. This section is only for paying first-class customers. You should move to the back." Micah's face burned and his throat tightened. "But this is my seat," he muttered. Ms. Bennett straightened up and shook her head. Her voice grew louder, as though making sure everyone could hear. "Come on, don't make a scene. Pack up your stuff and I'll find you a more appropriate seat." The words "more appropriate" felt like a slap in the face. Micah swallowed hard and looked around. Some passengers pretended not to notice, while others stared, their gazes a mix of curiosity and indifference. No one spoke up. With heavy steps, he unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed his backpack, and stood up following Ms. Bennett as she led him to the economy section. She never looked back, walking away as though she had just completed a simple task. Micah walked feeling smaller than ever. His fingers trembled as he pulled out his phone quickly, texting his mom, "Mom, they made me leave my seat." He slumped into an empty seat in the back, gripping the phone tightly. His heart was still pounding with humiliation. He didn't understand why Ms. Bennett treated him like this. He had done everything right, checked his ticket, followed the rules, but it seemed none of that mattered. The passenger's stares still burned into him. No one stood up for him. No one asked if he was okay. Micah waited for a reply, knowing his mom was in a meeting. He imagined her Clarissa Sullivan sitting at a large desk with colleagues reviewing reports. She would never expect to receive a message like this. The message had been sent, but no reply came. A middle-aged man sitting next to him cleared his throat and glanced at him with a strange look. "Are you okay, kid?" he asked. His voice wasn't particularly harsh, but it wasn't warm either. Micah nodded, swallowing his tears. "Yeah, I'm fine." He lied. The man nodded, not asking any more questions. He turned away, clearly not wanting to get involved. Micah pressed his face against the window. Outside, the runway glowed with the golden afternoon light. Ground staff hustled around, preparing for takeoff. The hum of the engines below began to vibrate through the floor, steady and distant, a reminder that in just a few minutes he would be trapped in this airplane, thousands of feet above the ground, unable to fix the injustice that had just happened. His phone buzzed in his hand. His mom had replied, "Why did they make you leave your seat?" Micah quickly typed back, "The flight attendant said I wasn't allowed to sit in first class. She made me move to the back." There was a long pause. Then 3 dots appeared, signaling that his mom was typing, "What flight number?" Micah's heart raced. He quickly looked at his boarding pass and typed the number, Flight 492. The message from Micah's mother eased his heart somewhat, but the worry in his chest still wouldn't go away. Even through just a few lines of text, he could sense the familiar calmness that was almost cold, the calmness that Clarissa Sullivan always carried. But underneath it was a simmering anger no one wanted to confront. Micah gripped his phone tightly, his eyes still locked on the last text. "Stay where you are. Don't worry about anything." He wanted to believe his mother's words truly, but his stomach was still tied in knots. He shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes darting around. The flight attendants were checking seat belts and overhead compartments. He couldn't see Ms. Bennett anywhere. Maybe she had gone back to first class, where, according to her, he shouldn't be. The captain's voice came over the loudspeaker, announcing that the plane was about to take off. Micah bent down to fasten his seatbelt, his hands still shaking. He hated this feeling of being so small. He never wanted to attract attention. He just wanted to sit in the seat his mom had bought for him peacefully, like everyone else. In first class, Ms. Bennett appeared again. She still looked crisp and confident. She gently adjusted the food tray for a man in a sharp suit, smiling as she handed him another drink. Micah watched from afar. Ms. Bennett looked like someone who had never humiliated a child in front of an entire plane. In the small galley, the young flight attendant. Sophie hesitated before quietly asking, "Is there something wrong with that boy's ticket?" Ms. Bennett adjusted her uniform, not bothering to look up. "It's probably just a system error," she replied curtly. Sophie frowned, her voice dropping lower. "Have you checked the ticket?" Ms. Bennett waved her hand dismissively, her tone dripping with self-satisfaction. "I've been in this job for years. I can tell who doesn't belong. What do you think a kid like that sitting in first class by himself?" Sophie hesitated. She had flown many times and knew that children in first class weren't that rare. But the way Ms. Bennett emphasized a kid like that made her uncomfortable. Still, Sophie chose to remain silent. Arguing with Ms. Bennett would only invite trouble. The other flight attendants finished their checks. The plane began to taxi down the runway. Micah clenched his hands together, his ears ringing as the plane picked up speed and lifted into the air. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't worry about anything." But Micah knew this wasn't going to end easily. The plane soared through thick clouds, but in Micah's mind, everything was still spinning. His seat seemed to shrink. Though the passengers around him had already sunk into their own worlds, Micah still felt the weight of the earlier stares pressing on him. He sighed and glanced at his phone again. There were no new messages from his mom. His fingers hovered over the screen. He wanted to ask his mom what she was doing, to beg her to come right away. But he stopped himself. He knew his mother, Clarissa Sullivan, didn't need to shout or rush. When she acted, everything would be handled. Up in the front, Ms. Bennett continued her usual tasks. She poured tea, arranged trays, smiled at passengers who barely responded. This was her favorite part of the job, controlling everything, maintaining perfect order. After more than 15 years in the job, Ms. Bennett truly believed she knew all the rules. She was certain she could look at someone and immediately know who deserved to sit in first class. And in her eyes, Micah Sullivan was clearly not one of those people. Ms. Bennett was proud of her quick discovery. In her mind, moving Micah to economy was a way of upholding standards. She didn't see anything wrong with what she had done. But what she didn't know was that her actions had set off a storm far bigger than she could imagine. Meanwhile, Micah sat still, as if frozen. He tried scrolling through his phone, looking for something to distract him from the suffocating feeling. But nothing could take his mind off what had just happened. He didn't feel anger, at least not yet. The dominant feeling right now was one of smallness. He thought about his mom, about everything she had sacrificed for him to be where he was today. She had always told him to be confident, to hold his head high. But how could he when just one strange look was enough to negate his worth? His phone suddenly buzzed. "Mom, I just spoke with the airline. Keep your phone with you." Micah sat up straight, gripping his phone tightly. He didn't know exactly what his mother was doing, but he understood one thing. This was far from over. In a towering office far away, Clarissa Sullivan, the CEO of the airline, stood firm behind a large desk. Her gaze was cold, and her voice echoed through the conference call. Beside her, Nathan Pierce, her trusted assistant, stood silently, his face betraying his discomfort. He had witnessed Clarissa handle many difficult situations, but this was different. Clarissa's voice rang out calm, but as sharp as a knife. "Let me be clear. My son was removed from his first-class seat without reason. Your staff didn't bother checking his ticket, didn't manage the passenger list properly. The decision was made purely based on personal prejudice." On the other end of the call, the head of the flight department stammered, searching for an excuse. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand your concern." But Clarissa cut him off, her tone unwavering. "No buts." Clarissa Sullivan bluntly pointed out that the flight attendant had forcibly removed her son from his first-class seat without checking the passenger list or verifying the ticket, all based solely on her personal judgment. On the other end of the call, the head of the flight operations department stammered, trying to make excuses. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand your concern." But Clarissa interrupted, her voice calm, but as sharp as a blade. "There are no buts. I want the name of the flight attendant responsible. I want a detailed report on the entire incident, and I want it on my desk before that plane lands." Nathan Pierce, standing nearby, cleared his throat. "Should I inform the captain?" Ma'am Clarissa didn't hesitate and decisively hung up the phone. She leaned back in her chair, massaging her temples, taking a deep breath to calm herself. Throughout her career, she had fought against all forms of discrimination to reach where she was today. But this time was different. This time, it was about her son. Micah Sullivan, and she couldn't just stand by. Despite being thousands of miles away, Clarissa still held control. About 30 minutes after the plane had reached cruising altitude, while passengers were sipping drinks and staring at screens, an announcement crackled over the plane's PA system. "Ms. Bennett, please report to the cockpit immediately." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted slightly. Some passengers glanced up, sensing something unusual. Usually, flight attendants weren't called directly to the cockpit in the middle of a flight like this. Micah looked up, his heart pounding. "Up front." Ms. Bennett furrowed her brow and quickly wiped her hands on a napkin. She wasn't worried. In her mind, it was probably just the captain needing an update about the service. She straightened her uniform and walked briskly toward the front, the sound of her heels tapping lightly on the carpet. What Ms. Bennett didn't know was that in just a few minutes her entire career would change forever. She walked down the narrow corridor leading to the cockpit. The steady hum of the plane's engines filled the air, but there was a strange heaviness in the hallway. She knew the flight procedures well. Occasionally, flight attendants were called up for minor reasons, But this time the way her name was called, decisive and cold, made her heart tighten. Ms. Bennett told herself there was nothing to fear. She had done everything right. She had upheld the first-class standards. There was no mistake here. She gently knocked on the door. The lock clicked open, and she stepped inside. The cockpit was dimly lit by the control panel's glow. Captain Dalton sat upright, one hand on the yoke. He was an experienced pilot, typically calm, but today his expression was visibly heavy. Beside him, the first officer quietly glanced at the internal phone screen where a video call was open. The face on the screen was all too familiar. Clarissa Sullivan. Ms. Bennett swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice professional. "Captain, did you call for me?" Captain Dalton sighed, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the armrest. "Ms. Bennett, we have a serious problem." She frowned, pretending not to understand. "How can I help?" Sir Clarissa's voice came through the cockpit, loud and clear, each word firm and precise. "Let's start by explaining why you kicked my son out of first class." Ms. Bennett froze. I'm sorry." Captain Dalton folded his arms, remaining silent, allowing Clarissa to lead the conversation. "My son, Micah Sullivan." Clarissa continued, her voice restrained but full of power. "A 10-year-old child, whom you humiliated in front of the entire cabin. A child. You didn't even bother to check his ticket before making him move to economy." Ms. Bennett felt her throat dry up. I was just following the usual procedure. Sometimes children sit in the wrong section. I just wanted to make sure." "Don't insult my intelligence," Clarissa interrupted sharply. "We both know what you did." Ms. Bennett's face flushed with heat. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this time all the power was on the other side. Captain Dalton finally spoke, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Ms. Bennett, did you check the passenger list before asking the boy to leave his seat?" Ms. Bennett hesitated. "I did, yes or no?" Clarissa coldly pressed. Ms. Bennett swallowed hard. "No." The cockpit fell into a heavy silence. Captain Dalton shook his head, disheartened. "You didn't verify. The name, didn't check the ticket. Just based on first impressions." He spoke slowly. "Based on what instinct appearance?" Miss Bennett's heart pounded in her chest. "It was just a misunderstanding." She stammered. "No," Clarissa snapped. "You thought the boy wasn't worthy." Ms. Bennett opened her mouth but quickly shut it. There was no more defense. The first officer quietly glanced at Captain Dalton, waiting for orders. Captain Dalton rubbed his forehead tiredly before giving his command. "By order from headquarters, you will personally return Micah Sullivan to his original seat, and you will do it with a sincere apology." His voice was firm, not allowing for any objections. Ms. Bennett felt her chest tighten. She had never been required in her career to publicly apologize to a passenger, let alone walk through the entire cabin, admitting her mistake in front of everyone. Her face turned red with embarrassment. "Captain," she tried to keep her voice low, suggesting, "how about we deal with this after we land?" "It's not a suggestion." Clarissa Sullivan's voice from the other end was icy. Miss Bennett gritted her teeth, knowing she had no other choice. "Understood," she whispered. She left the cockpit, her hands cold. Each step toward the passenger cabin felt heavier, weighed down by her own guilt. In economy class, Micah Sullivan still gripped his phone. His mother's last message kept repeating in his head, "Stay where you are. I've got this." He couldn't imagine what his mother had done from the ground, what connections she had pulled, but he could clearly feel the air around him changing. Then he heard someone clear their throat softly beside him. Micah looked up. There stood Miss Bennett, no longer the cold, confident figure he had known. She now appeared awkward and uneasy. "Mr. Sullivan." She spoke softer than usual. There was a misunderstanding. I'd like to return you to your original seat." Micah didn't stand up right away. He felt the curious, whispering gazes from the rows around him. Some passengers had witnessed her pulling him from his seat earlier, and now they were all watching to see what would happen next. "Why was it a misunderstanding?" Micah asked calmly. Ms. Bennet hesitated. Clearly, she hadn't expected him to respond this way. "I didn't check your ticket carefully," she admitted, her voice strained. "I'm sorry." The apology sounded insincere, as if she had been forced to say it. Micah stared at her for a long moment, then slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and followed Ms. Bennet back to first class. Passengers whispered quietly. Some turned away, pretending not to notice while others subtly watched. But the truth was clear. When Ms. Bennet had forced Micah out of his seat, no one had dared to speak up. In his defense, Micah entered first class. The atmosphere here felt entirely different. He sat down in his original seat, calmly placing his backpack beside him. Miss Bennet stood there awkwardly for a moment before mumbling, "If you need anything, just call Micah." Didn't respond, only taking out his phone and texting his mom, "I'm back in first class." A few seconds later, Clarissa Sullivan's reply appeared. "Good. Stay in place. I'll handle the rest." Micah leaned back in his seat. He could feel that with Ms. Bennet, the trouble had only just begun. Ms. Bennet turned and quickly walked toward the galley, but every heavy gaze from the passengers followed her like a shadow. Throughout her years in the job, she had always been the one in control, the one who gave orders, the one who decided who deserved to be. Where, now that power had slipped out of her hands, Bennet gripped the edge of the service counter with trembling hands, trying to regain her composure. But her mind was spinning. The passengers had seen everything, how she had dragged Micah out of his seat, how she had to bring him back, how she had been forced to apologize. A voice suddenly called out from behind, making her jump. "Are you okay?" Ms. Bennet turned around. Sophie, the young flight attendant, was leaning against the coffee machine, her arms crossed in front of her chest. Her gaze was hard to read, half curiosity, half judgment. Ms. Bennet forced a stiff smile. "Of course, Sophie didn't take her eyes off her. You were called up to the cockpit because of that, weren't you?" Ms. Bennet exhaled sharply through her nose, trying to hide her embarrassment. "It's none of your business." Sophie tilted her head slightly. When the CEO personally gets involved, it becomes everyone's business. Those words hit Ms. Bennet like a slap to the face. Her heart tightened. Sophie continued, her voice light but sharp. "I've flown many times, but I've never seen a first-class passenger kicked out if their ticket was valid." "That boy's ticket was valid, right?" Ms. Bennet swallowed Sophie. She snapped, "Mind your own business." Sophie shrugged slightly. "Yes, ma'am." But her gaze made it clear that she wasn't fooled by Ms. Bennet's feigned calmness. Ms. Bennet turned away, adjusting her uniform, reminding herself that she had to regain her composure. No matter what this flight would eventually end, she just had to endure a little longer. In first class, Micah sat quietly. Clarissa Sullivan hadn't sent any more messages, but he knew she was still closely monitoring everything. He could feel the change around him. The flight attendants now avoided his gaze no longer. The dismissive, condescending attitude from before. Even the passengers, the ones who had remained silent when he was dragged away, had begun whispering. The feeling of humiliation from earlier was slowly giving way to something else, strength. For the first time in hours, Micah no longer felt small. About 20 minutes later, the internal phone in the cockpit rang. Captain Dalton picked up the receiver, holding it to his ear. "This is the captain." On the other end was a calm voice, but the power behind each word was unmistakable. "Captain, this is Nathan Pierce from the corporate office." Captain Dalton tightened his grip on the armrest. Nathan continued. Clarissa Sullivan demands immediate action regarding the incident on Flight 492. Effective immediately, Ms. Bennett will be suspended from duty as soon as we land. Captain Dalton exhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a moment. He wasn't surprised by the decision from corporate headquarters. Understood, he replied shortly. Nathan Pierce continued his tone, calm but firm. When the plane lands, Ms. Bennett will be escorted for questioning at the airport. She will not be allowed to leave the area until the process is complete. Captain Dalton nodded. I'll ensure that's done. Nathan had one more request. Clarissa Sullivan wants a direct report from you on how you handled this situation. And that's not a suggestion. Captain Dalton wasn't surprised. In the thousands of flights he had commanded, he'd encountered many troubles. Disruptive passengers, unprofessional crew members, escalating situations. But this time was different. This wasn't just a problem. This was a consequence. He hung up, turning to the first officer and shaking his head lightly. Miss Bennett's day is about to get a lot worse. In the galley, Ms. Bennett's world began to crumble. She was pouring coffee when Sophie walked over, holding the internal phone. There's a call for you, Sophie said, her tone indifferent, handing her the receiver. Miss Bennett took it, pressing the phone to her ear. This is Ms. Bennett. On the other end, a firm voice spoke, leaving no room for resistance. Ms. Bennett, as soon as the plane lands, you will report directly to the operations office for an inquiry. You are not allowed to leave the airport without permission. Security personnel will meet you at the gate. Ms. Bennett's stomach twisted. I don't understand, she stammered. The voice remained unchanged. Orders from Clarissa Sullivan. You are required to comply. Understood. Ms. Bennett's throat went dry. Understood, she whispered. The call disconnected. Sophie stood there, her gaze half curious, half cold. Bad news. Sophie asked, her voice light but her eyes sharp. Miss Bennett didn't answer. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the coffee pot down. The unease from before had now turned into full-blown panic. For the first time since she decided to kick Micah out of first class, Miss Bennett realized just how serious her mistake had been. She had thought of him as just another ordinary child. She had believed no one would care. She had been sure she wouldn't have to face any consequences. But she was wrong, and now she was about to pay a heavy price. Miss Bennett stood frozen in the small galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, while the world around her seemed to blur. The hum of the plane's engines, the clink of glasses, the murmurs of passengers, all of it felt distant, like an echo. She had worked in this industry for years, facing difficult passengers, emergency situations, and even sudden chaos. But never before had she been struck down like this. The image of security personnel waiting for her at the gate haunted her, making it hard to breathe. Sophie stood quietly nearby, watching her as though waiting for a reaction. Miss Bennett tried to hold herself together, trying to appear calm, keeping her last bit of dignity. "Give me some time," she mumbled, her voice raspy. Without waiting for a response, she staggered through the curtain, retreating into the crew rest area. Inside, the space was cramped and suffocating. She leaned her forehead against the cold metal wall, taking shaky breaths. She needed to think of something. She had to salvage this. Maybe she could talk to Captain Dalton, explain that this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe she could mitigate the consequences before the plane landed. But deep inside, Ms. Bennett knew there was no way out. She had thrown a legitimate passenger out of first class. She had humiliated a child based on prejudice. And most importantly, she had offended the wrong person, Clarissa Sullivan. In first class, Micah Sullivan leaned back in his seat, stretching his legs out. feeling the unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. A few hours ago, he had felt small, invisible. Now he could feel the power his mother wielded, casting a shadow over the cabin. The flight attendants kept asking him if he wanted more juice, if he needed a snack, if his seat was comfortable. Micah let them fuss around him, responding with only a nod or a shake of his head, staying silent. He didn't need more juice. He didn't need pastries. He just wanted them to understand that the reason they were treating him differently now wasn't because of who he was, but because they knew who his mother was. Micah looked around the cabin. Some passengers avoided his gaze while others sneaked glances. They knew, they had witnessed it, and they understood that this situation was about much more than just a seat. A well-dressed man across from him in a sharp suit unexpectedly spoke up, his voice hesitant. I saw what happened earlier." Micah turned his head, waiting silently. The man shifted in his seat, his face showing signs of awkwardness. It was unfortunate Micah blinked, watching him coldly. The man in the stiff suit nodded, trying to appear polite. "Well, I guess it was a misunderstanding." Micah Sullivan tilted his head, his gaze cold. "You think it was a misunderstanding when she asked me to leave my seat." The man paused, his fingers tightening around his wine glass. Micah didn't look away. "Do you also think it was a misunderstanding when none of you spoke up?" The businessman swallowed, offering a forced laugh. I guess so." "You guess?" So Micah interrupted, his voice calm, but as sharp as a knife. The man's face turned red, and he lowered his gaze, staring intently at the safety instructions leaflet that he hadn't bothered to touch before Micah turned his face to the window. He let the silence linger, allowing them to feel the shame they should have felt long ago. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. This was about everyone who witnessed the injustice and chose to remain silent. In the cockpit, Captain Dalton sat in thought, his eyes gazing out at the clear blue sky. His hand remained on the control panel, but his mind had drifted far away. In more than 20 years of flying, he had seen almost everything: fights in economy, unruly passengers, unprofessional crew members, even having to physically restrain someone trying to force their way into the cockpit to argue about the weather. But this time was different. This wasn't just a flight attendant's mistake. This was the consequence of a hasty decision that could ruin a career, and worse, that decision deserved to be punished. As soon as Captain Dalton heard Clarissa Sullivan's voice on the phone, he knew that Ms. Bennett had no way out. In this industry, everyone understood, you can't humiliate the son of the CEO and then walk away, scot-free. Still, a part of him felt bitter. How many times had similar things happened with no one standing up for those treated unfairly, simply because they weren't someone important? How many mistakes had been covered up because the victim didn't have a voice? Captain Dalton exhaled through his nose. Now all he could do was one thing: land this flight safely and let the airline deal with the wound that had just been exposed. In the galley, Ms. Bennett was living her nightmare. She glanced at the clock. Less than an hour before the plane would land. She tried to smooth down her uniform, regulate her breathing, but her hands still trembled. No matter how much she tried to reassure herself, she knew this battle she had lost. Ms. Bennett had risen from the lowest position years ago, slowly building a reputation as the one who held power on any flight she worked. But now she would be escorted off the plane like a problem that needed to be dealt with urgently. The irony made her stomach twist. She wiped the sweat off her forehead with a napkin, acutely aware of the change in the way her colleagues were treating her. No one looked her in the eye anymore. No one greeted her with their usual chatter. No one needed her orders anymore. Sophie passed by, glancing at her before stopping. "Maybe you should sit down and prepare for landing." Sophie gently suggested. Ms. Bennett shot the young woman a sharp look. "I don't need you to tell me what to do." Sophie shrugged. Up to you. Ms. Bennet clenched her fists, anger boiling inside. She wanted to shout at them. She wanted to reclaim the respect she once had, but she couldn't, not anymore. Instead, she stood still, her eyes fixed on the countdown clock, waiting for the moment when she would have to face the truth. In first class, Micah's phone buzzed. A new message from his mom. Mom, 30 minutes to landing. Security is waiting at the gate. Stay calm. Micah smiled a half smile. There was no more fear in him. Ms. Bennet had tried to make him feel undeserving, but now it was different. The one about to face judgment wasn't him, but her. The plane began to descend, cutting through thick gray clouds. The seatbelt sign lit up, and the announcement came through the cabin. Micah fastened his seatbelt, still holding his phone. His mom's message blinked on the screen like a promise. Security is waiting. Micah glanced around the cabin. Some passengers had begun gathering their things, preparing for landing like any normal flight. But there were others, those who had witnessed everything, sitting still, their faces tense. They knew what was waiting at the end of this flight. Micah could clearly feel the change in their gazes, no longer the indifference from before. Now it was guilt, unease, and shame, and he let them feel it. In the galley, Ms. Bennet gripped the edge of the counter. She stared at the white wall in front of her, feeling as though she were about to suffocate. She knew in just a few minutes, when she stepped off this plane, she would face security personnel, the HR department, and perhaps even Clarissa Sullivan. She would be questioned. She could be suspended. She could be fired, and no excuse would be enough to erase what she had done. Ms. Bennet breathed heavily, wondering if there was any way to salvage this. She could blame the procedure, the misunderstanding, anything else. But deep in her heart, she knew the fault was hers, and this time no one would save her. Miss Bennet fumbled, searching for a way out of the mess, hoping that if she took control, at least she could manage the narrative. She told herself she could blame the training system, use the excuse that she was just following the procedure, that she only did what she thought was right. But even as these defenses formed in her mind, she knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. It was a choice, and choices always come with consequences. Sophie entered the galley, glancing at her silent for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know what's about to happen?" Miss Bennet swallowed. "I don't need a lecture." "Sophie." Sophie crossed her arms and leaned against the galley counter. "You don't need a lecture. You need to start thinking about your next job." Bennet clenched her fists. "It's not over yet." Sophie raised an eyebrow, giving a slight smile. "Are you sure?" Miss Bennet opened her mouth to respond, but then silently closed it. They both knew the answer. Captain Dalton's voice came through the plane's PA system, pulling all passengers back to reality. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived. The time is now 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft comes to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with us today." Micah Sullivan let out a long breath, feeling the plane's wheels touch the runway and slowly begin to decelerate. Through the window, he could see the terminal ahead and beyond, that a group of uniformed security officers standing at the gate waiting. Micah tightened the strap on his backpack. He wasn't scared. No nerves. He was simply ready. Passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. In first class, guests would typically be the first to leave, a privilege that Ms. Bennet had once managed strictly. But today she was the one being escorted off the plane. Sophie glanced at Ms. Bennet, her expression neither smug nor sympathetic, just practical. "You should go," Sophie said quietly. "It'll be less humiliating if you leave on your own, rather than being dragged off like a criminal." Ms. Bennet's throat was dry. She forced herself to walk toward the exit, each step heavy as though she were carrying the weight of a building on her shoulders. As soon as she stepped off the plane, the air seemed to freeze. The security personnel didn't need to lift a finger. They simply stood there enough for everyone to understand. It was over. One of them spoke, his voice cold but polite. "Ms. Bennett, please follow us." Ms. Bennett hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning around, looking for a hopeless escape. The passengers, those who had once been indifferent when she controlled the first-class cabin, were now watching her every move. Some surprised, others silently turning away. Micah remained seated, his gaze calm, sharp, no anger, no shouting. His silence was the heaviest sentence, with no other choice. "Miss." Bennett walked off the plane, leaving behind both her career and her shattered pride. Another flight attendant, not Ms. Bennett, approached Micah with a forced smile. "Mr. Sullivan, is there anything you need before disembarking?" Micah shook his head, his voice calm. "No, thank you." The flight attendant quickly stepped back, making way for him. Micah slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked out of the plane. And right in front of him, he saw his mother. Clarissa Sullivan stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze calm but full of authority. No anger, no harshness. Just her presence made the world around her feel like it slowed down. Micah walked toward her shoulders, squared eyes, steady. "Are you okay?" Clarissa asked, her voice. "Even?" He nodded. "Yes." She looked at him one more time, making sure his answer was genuine. "Good," she said. "Let's go together." They walked out of the terminal, leaving behind a heavy chapter. On the other side of the airport, Ms. Bennett was escorted down a separate path, the sound of her heels tapping softly on the cold floor. Her career was over, her reputation destroyed. A mistake, or rather a choice, had ruined everything. In the end, every lesson had been handed out. Some lessons are easy, some lessons are bitter, and Ms. Bennett's lesson. It came at 35,000 feet, and by the time she realized it, it was too late. The terminal buzzed with announcements, the sound of rolling luggage, the rush of passengers chatting. But for Micah, the world seemed quieter than ever. Clarissa walked alongside him, her demeanor calm, but no one dared to dismiss it. He knew that look she wore in important meetings, when making decisions that affected thousands of people. They passed through the security checkpoint, the loudspeaker ringing overhead. But Micah knew today wasn't over. His mother wasn't one to let things slide. She didn't climb to the top of the airline industry by letting injustice go unchecked. Today the issue was Ms. Bennett, and Clarissa Sullivan would deal with it her way. Nathan Pierce spoke firmly. "Ms. Bennett is currently in the Internal Affairs office. HR is handling the process, and she has been notified about the suspension decision." Micah Sullivan tilted his head, asking, "What does suspension mean?" Clarissa Sullivan looked directly at her son, her gaze cold. "It means she won't be serving on any flights in the near future." Micah nodded, showing no emotion. In truth, he wasn't sure how he should feel. Nathan cleared his throat. "We've also prepared a statement for the media in case this gets out of hand." Micah furrowed his brow. "Media?" Clarissa sighed, rubbing her temple lightly. "It's already out there." Nathan nodded in confirmation. "Some passengers posted the story on social media before we even landed. The news is spreading quickly because it involves the CEO's son. Micah felt a weight on his chest. He knew this was serious, but hearing that the whole world was talking about him still left him stunned. Clarissa regained her composure. "How is the internal investigation going?" Nathan adjusted his tie and replied, "They're gathering testimonies, but things don't look good for her. She made a decision, based on personal prejudice, didn't check or verify anything. Worse, she only admitted her mistake when forced to." Clarissa chuckled bitterly. "Too familiar?" Micah silently watched his mother handle the situation calmly, without raising her voice, yet making everyone around her hold their breath and obey. He had always admired that Nathan hesitated for a moment before asking Clarissa, We need to decide. Will we fire her immediately or give her a chance to explain? Clarissa was silent for a long time. Thinking deeply, Micah knew his mother was weighing her options. If they fired Ms. Bennett immediately, the message sent to the entire aviation industry would be very strong. Discrimination will not be tolerated. If they gave her a chance to explain, it would leave her with a path to take responsibility. Micah shifted in his seat and spoke up. What do you think she will do? Clarissa looked at him, her face thoughtful. People like her, she shook her head, only change when there's no way out. Micah swallowed. So you're going to fire her? Clarissa smiled lightly, her gaze softening. And you, what do you think? Micah paused. He had never considered that he had a say in such a big decision. He looked down at his hands, which were intertwined, and slowly said, This isn't just a mistake. She chose to do this. Clarissa nodded gently, listening quietly. If she had just checked the ticket like she was supposed to. Micah continued evenly, this wouldn't have happened, but she saw me and decided I didn't deserve to sit there. He took a deep breath. She needs to understand that her mistake wasn't because she was caught, but because from the start it was wrong. Clarissa leaned back in her chair and nodded. All right, then here's what we'll do. Nathan Pierce jumped up, ready to take notes. Clarissa spoke decisively. Ms. Bennett will be suspended indefinitely. She will have to complete comprehensive training on prejudice, prevention, and she will be required to write a statement acknowledging her wrongdoing. Nathan nodded vigorously, jotting it down in his notebook. Micah quietly asked, What if she refuses? Clarissa smiled faintly. Then she will never step foot on any of my flights again. Micah nodded. That seemed fair. Nathan closed his notebook. I'll make the arrangements right away. Clarissa sighed as if releasing a heavy burden. Good. She turned to Micah. Let's go, son. Micah stood up and adjusted his backpack. As they left the waiting room, he looked up and asked, If it were you, you would have fired her right away, wouldn't you? Clarissa laughed softly. If it were entirely my decision? She shrugged. Of course, Micah smiled faintly, but you gave her a chance. Clarissa looked at her son, her eyes glowing with pride. It wasn't me, it was you. Micah thought about that as they walked through the door, blending into the busy crowd. Today he had learned a valuable lesson. Power isn't just about punishment. Sometimes it's about making sure the lesson is truly absorbed, and for Ms. Bennett, that lesson had just begun. In a cold gray room behind the terminal, Ms. Bennett sat in silence. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glare against the stark white walls, making the room feel even colder. In front of her, a thick file lay open. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Passenger statements, an official complaint from corporate, and an evaluation of her actions on Flight 492. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her back stiff like a stone statue. She was no longer wearing her uniform. Immediately after being escorted off the plane, she had been stripped of her authority. The humiliation still lingered on her skin like a cold mist. She recalled the scrutinizing eyes, the looks of pity, the whispered words behind her back. Ms. Bennett, who had once been proud of her 20 years of experience, now sat there alone and powerless. The door opened. Nathan Pierce entered, his gaze sharp. He sat down across from her, placed the tablet on the table, slid his finger lightly across the screen, and then looked up, preparing to begin the most serious conversation of Ms. Bennett's career. Nathan Pierce looked up, his voice steady but firm. Ms. Bennett, I think you know why you're sitting here. Ms. Bennett swallowed, forcing herself to nod. Nathan tapped his fingers rhythmically on the table before asking, Do you want to explain why you made Micah Sullivan leave his first-class seat without checking the ticket? Ms. Bennett's throat felt dry. How many times on the way here had she rehearsed excuses in her mind, hoping to make the situation seem lighter? But now, sitting face to face with the real consequences, she knew no words could fix this. Still, she tried, I thought. She licked her lips, her voice trembling. I thought there was a system error. A child flying alone in first class, it didn't seem right. She paused, realizing she didn't even believe what she had just said. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Not right in your opinion. Ms. Bennett clenched her hands tightly. It wasn't normal. Nathan repeated, his voice growing colder with each beat. Not normal. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. If that child had been white, would you have reacted the same way? Ms. Bennett felt her stomach tighten. I don't know. Nathan stared at her intently, his voice lowering but doubling in weight. I think you know. Ms. Bennett gripped the edge of the table beneath it, taking a shaky breath. Nathan didn't wait for her to compose herself. Your intentions don't matter. Ms. Bennett, he interrupted. Only your actions matter. The air in the room felt thick. Nathan leaned forward, his tone even lower, but much heavier. Let me paint a clear picture for you. A 10-year-old boy flying alone with a valid first-class ticket. He sits quietly following all the rules. Yet you, without checking any information, without verifying anything based on a feeling, humiliated the child in front of everyone and had him moved to economy. Ms. Bennett's heartbeat thundered in her ears like a drumbeat. Nathan tilted his head, his gaze cold. Now tell me which part of that is right. Ms. Bennett choked. She knew there was no argument. Nathan let the silence stretch a few more seconds before continuing. Truth is, you saw a black boy sitting in first class, and you automatically assumed he didn't belong there. Ms. Bennett recoiled slightly, but she didn't protest because she knew he was right. Nathan sighed, leaning back in his chair. Clarissa Sullivan has agreed not to sue you, at least for now. His voice was as cold as steel. However, the airline has decided to suspend you indefinitely. You will undergo comprehensive bias training and be required to write a formal statement admitting your wrongdoing. Ms. Bennett blinked. A public statement. Nathan nodded, his face impassive. You will write an apology to Micah Sullivan and his family. This statement will be distributed internally to all staff. Furthermore, it will be used as training material in the bias prevention courses. Ms. Bennett felt her chest tighten as though it were burning from the inside out. You're turning me into a cautionary tale, she whispered. Nathan didn't deny it. Exactly. Ms. Bennett turned her face away, unable to bear his gaze. Just a month ago, she had stood strong in her role as a senior flight attendant, respected by colleagues, obeyed by passengers. Now she would be nothing more than an example of what not to do. Nathan slid the tablet toward her. This is a draft of the statement. You can either sign it or refuse. He emphasized, if you refuse, we will proceed with your termination. Miss Bennett stared at the screen. The words were clear, unforgiving. I, Emily Bennett, take full responsibility for my actions. On Flight 492, the decision to remove a first-class passenger without verifying the ticket was an act of discrimination, and I sincerely apologize to Micah Sullivan and his family. I commit to participating in training to prevent similar incidents in the future. Her hand trembled as she scrolled down to read it. She hated this place. She hated the situation she found herself in. She hated everything. But deep down she knew this was the consequence of her own actions. Nathan looked at her patiently, waiting. Ms. Bennett, shaking, placed her finger on the screen and clicked to confirm. Nathan nodded. Wise decision? He stood up, straightening his suit jacket. Someone will escort you out. After that, you'll receive instructions for the training sessions. Ms. Bennett nodded slightly, not daring to speak. Before leaving the room, Nathan paused for a moment, his voice lowering. I hope you truly learn your lesson, because there won't be a second chance. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Bennett alone in the cold room She let out a long breath, unaware she had been holding it all this time. For the first time in her career, Ms. Bennett no longer had power, no voice, nothing at all. And the worst part was she knew she deserved it. Elsewhere in her private office at the airline headquarters, Micah Sullivan sat on the soft leather sofa, his legs swinging gently. Through the large window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the towering buildings, turning the room golden. Micah had sat here before during the late-night meetings when his mother was busy, but today everything was different. Today he wasn't the one waiting. He was at the center of the storm. Clarissa Sullivan sat behind her desk, her eyes glued to her phone, scrolling through the latest updates from the operations department. Finally, she set the phone down, leaned back in her chair, and looked at her son. "Ms. Bennett has signed the statement," she said. Micah nodded, unsure of what to feel. Clarissa studied him carefully. "How do you feel about that?" Micah thought for a long moment. He remembered the feeling when he was forced out of his seat, the feeling of not belonging there, of being looked down upon just for being himself. Now the roles had reversed. The one who made him feel humiliated was now the one bowing her head in apology. In a small apartment on the other side of the city, Ms. Bennett slumped onto the sofa, the pale light from her laptop screen reflecting off her pale face. Her name hadn't appeared in the media yet, but Clarissa Bennett knew it was just a matter of time. She scrolled through the headlines, her hands trembling with anger and fear. The comments were full of outrage. Some demanded her firing. Others wanted the airline to release her name. Her 20-year career all reduced to rubble. By one foolish decision now felt like a sandcastle washed away by the waves. Her phone placed beside her buzzed. A message from an unknown number popped up. "I hope you never get a job again." "You racist." Ms. Bennett flinched, dropping the phone. She hadn't imagined things would turn out like this. She had thought that maybe a warning or a temporary suspension was the worst that could happen. But the reality before her was something else. She felt like she was being hunted. She opened her email, her hands shaking. A message from Human Resources appeared. Subject mandatory. Bias training and public statement submission. Clarissa clicked on it. Due to your suspension, you are required to submit an official statement acknowledging your actions on Flight 492. Failure to comply will result in the immediate termination of your employment. Ms. Bennett sat frozen. She knew she was wrong. She should have checked the ticket. She should have been more careful. But the anger from the crowd online made her chest ache with shame. She had once been praised a model employee. She had been rewarded for her dedication. Could one mistake, even a big one, justify destroying everything? Clarissa sat still for a long time in front of her computer screen. Finally, she began typing. "Dear Human Resources, I sincerely apologize for what happened on Flight 492. I apologize to Micah Sullivan and his family for the unfortunate misunderstanding. I commit to learning and improving my behavior." She stared at the lifeless text on the screen. It wasn't a heartfelt apology, but perhaps it was enough to save whatever shred of her career remained. She hit send. The laptop closed with a sharp click. Ms. Bennett sat still in the dark. Back in Micah's room, he lay on his back staring up at the ceiling, his phone discarded to the side. Today it all started with one simple decision, and now Micah was faced with another. He could let the world dictate his story, the media, strangers on the internet, or his mother's company, or he could take control himself. Micah sat up, opened the camera on his phone. He hesitated for a moment. He had never recorded a video like this before. Then, taking a deep breath, he pressed record. Micah's eyes met the lens, his voice calm, certain. "Hey everyone. By now I'm sure you've all heard about what happened to me on Flight 492. I just want to say thank you to those who spoke up. But this story isn't just about me. It's about those who don't have a mom as the CEO, about those who don't have anyone standing up for them. Micah paused, took a breath. If you really care about what happened to me, pay attention to what's happening around you. Speak up when you see something wrong. Don't wait until it's trending. He stared directly into the camera, then concluded, because next time the victim might not be the child of a CEO, and they'll need your voice more than I do. Micah hit stop, and without thinking too much posted the video on social media. Within a few hours, the video began spreading like wildfire. Micah had no idea. Within a day, the airline would have to issue a public statement. Within a week, they would face accusations of systemic discrimination. And in just a month, Micah Sullivan would be sitting in front of a national television camera, asked a question he never thought he'd hear. Micah, what do you want to change? Because right now, this wasn't just about a bad flight. This was about something much bigger, about justice. Micah sat in the back of an SUV, the city passing by outside the window. Clarissa sat beside him, her phone ringing constantly with notifications from high-level executives' legal teams and even television stations requesting interviews. She glanced over at Micah, noticing he was quietly staring out the window. "Are you okay?" Clarissa asked. Micah nodded, but Clarissa could tell something heavy was on her son's mind. They sat in silence for a few minutes, then Clarissa spoke. "When something like this blows up, you can't pull it back." Micah turned his head. I know Clarissa studied her son's face. "Are you sure you want to keep going with this?" Micah took a deep breath. "I didn't choose to get involved, but now that I am right." Clarissa smiled lightly. "Yes." Micah drummed his fingers on his knee, whispering, "I just don't want people to think I'm doing this for attention." Clarissa leaned in, placing a hand on his shoulder, reassuring him, "They'll understand. Those who are willing to listen will get it." Micah leaned his head back against the seat, his eyes half closed as the city streets rushed past the window. Not far away, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A new notification popped up on the screen. $5,000. New comments on his video. Micah didn't even have the energy to read them all, but one comment made him stop. Tasha wrote, "Micah, you don't know, but so many people like me needed to hear what you just said. I've been in your position, but I didn't have anyone strong enough to stand up for me. Thank you for speaking out." Micah read the line twice. A strange feeling surged in his chest. The 10-year-old boy who once thought of himself as small and insignificant now realized that his voice truly had power. Across the city, in a dimly lit small kitchen, Clarissa Bennett sat motionless at an old wooden table. The light from her laptop screen cast a cold glow on her pale face. The apology statement she had signed earlier that morning was now released internally by the airline, but the public response was not what she had hoped for. No one believed her apology. They called it a PR stunt. They called it insincere. Though her name hadn't been publicly revealed yet, the passengers on the flight, though sharp enough, had quickly figured out who she was. Emails flooded in from former colleagues, strangers, even distant relatives. Some offered words of encouragement, but most were filled with anger. News was everywhere. Flight attendants suspended over discrimination incident. The silent problem in the airline industry, CEO's Sun sparks national dialogue on racial discrimination in travel. Clarissa Bennett pulled at her hair in frustration, feeling as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. Worse still, the image of Micah Sullivan's eyes when she asked him to leave the seat still haunted her. That day, everything she did seemed normal following the procedure. But now, for the first time in her life, she had to ask herself, was the way I've been working all this time really right? She knew the answer. Clarissa closed the laptop and placed her hands on her tired face. At the same time, in the quiet room, Micah curled up under the warm blankets, the soft nightlight casting a gentle glow on the ceiling. Outside the window, the city was still loud bustling. Micah scrolled through his phone one last time. The news, the comments, the constant stream of messages. He had never wanted to be the center of such a debate. He just wanted to be treated fairly. But now this was no longer just about him, and maybe that was a good thing. His phone vibrated again. A message from his mother, Clarissa Sullivan. "Good night, my dear. Tomorrow. We have a lot to discuss." Micah sighed, placing his phone on the table. Tomorrow. Tomorrow this battle would continue. Tomorrow there would still be those who doubted, those who thought he was overreacting. But there would also be those who believed him, those who had experienced the pain just like he had. And for those people, Micah Sullivan knew he had to keep going. He pulled the blanket over himself, closed his eyes, and told himself, "Tomorrow, I'll keep fighting. Life can change in an instant. A small decision, a fleeting glance can lead to consequences greater than anyone could imagine. But it's also from these moments that a small voice can become a powerful force. A simple act can spark change." Micah Sullivan didn't just reclaim his seat. He reclaimed his voice and ignited hope for thousands of others who have silently endured injustice without anyone speaking up for them. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how to move forward in the present. And each one of us has the chance, no matter how small, to create a fairer, kinder world. If this story touched your heart, give the video a like. Share it to empower others. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to join us on a journey of spreading kind stories and inspiration every day. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We look forward to seeing you in the next stories.